There is a city underneath Boston, not a ruin in the classical sense, not a scattering of foundations left by some earlier settlement that burned down and was rebuilt on top of. A full city, with streets below the streets, with windows sealed under the current sidewalk level, with building entrances that used to face the sky now facing packed earth and landfill and the underside of a modern road surface. And the people who live and work above it walk over it every single day without being told what is directly beneath their feet. The official history of Boston's land expansion is taught in schools and printed in tourism brochures and repeated confidently by historians who have every credential and no curiosity about what the expansion actually covered. The story goes like this. Outer Boston was originally a small peninsula called the Shawmut Peninsula. The early colonists found it useful because it was easy to defend. Over centuries, as the population grew and commerce expanded, the city needed more land. So they filled in the tidal flats and the harbour edges and the bay inlets using dirt and gravel and rubble. They raised the hills and dumped the material into the water. They kept doing this for 200 years until the peninsula grew into the landmass that exists today, hundreds of acres of land created from nothing. A genuine engineering accomplishment of the 19th century. That is the story. It sounds reasonable. It has dates attached to it and names of engineers and records of contracts. It has the appearance of complete documentation. But the documentation has gaps in it that the official account has never satisfactorily addressed. And when you follow those gaps, they lead somewhere that the official account cannot afford to go. Because what was already there when the filling began tells a different story than the one the filling was supposed to create. What was already there, already built, already inhabited, already old, required the filling not as an act of creation, but as an act of burial. Boston was not built up, Boston was built over. To understand what that means, you have to start not with the landfill operations of the 1800s, but with the maps that exist from before them. Early maps of Boston from the late 1700s show a coastline that differs from the current one by hundreds of acres. That part is well known. What is less discussed is what those maps show inside the original peninsula. They show a street grid that is denser than what should exist on a colonial-era settlement of the population size the records claim. They show building footprints in areas that were supposedly tidal flats or harbour water at the time. They show infrastructure, specifically drainage infrastructure, that runs in directions inconsistent with the surface topography as it was officially described. When surveyors and engineers working on the 19th century fill projects began cutting into the ground across what are now the Back Bay and South End neighbourhoods, they did not find the natural bay sediment and tidal mud they expected as a baseline. In documented cases that appear in the engineering journals of the period, they found worked stone, cut granite, dressed masonry, foundations laid in patterns that indicated deliberate construction. The response to these findings in the official record is telling. They are categorized consistently as remnants of previous fill attempts or debris from earlier development or colonial-era construction that had subsided. Every explanation assumes that whatever was found was young, was recent, was part of the known history. None of the explanations engage with the depth at which the material was found, or the precision of the stonework relative to what colonial-era Boston was supposed to be capable of producing, or the scale of the foundations relative to the building types the records describe for that period. What you find at depth in Boston is not what the colonial record predicts. And the colonial record was written by the same institutional apparatus that was simultaneously burying it. The Back Bay landfill project is the most extensively documented piece of Boston's expansion history. It ran from 1857 through the 1880s. The project filled in the shallow tidal basin that existed west of the original Shawmut Peninsula. The fill material came primarily from the hills of Needham, transported by a railroad specifically built for the project. Gravel trains ran around the clock at the peak of the operation. Thousands of cubic yards of material were deposited daily. The rate was fast, the scale was enormous, and the result was hundreds of acres of new real estate laid out in the grid pattern that is now one of the most recognizable urban forms in America. The grid of the Back Bay is orderly, almost perfectly orderly. Commonwealth Avenue runs in a straight line. The cross streets are lettered in alphabetical sequence. The blocks are consistent in dimension. This is not how cities grow organically. This is not how colonial settlements expand through generations of incremental development. This is a planned district dropped onto new ground in a compressed time frame. The question that never appears in the standard histories is why that grid was chosen. What model was it based on? Boston's existing street network at the time was famously irregular, the product of centuries of organic growth following old paths and property lines and waterways. The sudden appearance of a perfectly rational grid on the filled land to the west is attributed to the influence of Haussmann's Paris renovations and American city planning movements of the period. That explanation sounds convincing until you ask which came first, the grid or the plan, and discover that the layout of the Back Bay grid corresponds in its proportions and its orientation to features of the landscape that were already there before the fill arrived. The orientation of Commonwealth Avenue is not arbitrary. It aligns with a sightline to specific elevated points on the original Shawmut Peninsula. It aligns in a way that suggests the grid was not designed by the Back Bay commissioners but was inherited from something that already determined the spatial relationships of that territory. The commissioners laid their streets along lines that were already implied by the landscape. And the landscape carried those implications because something had already been organized there before the tidal water covered it, or before the official story said the tidal water was there at all. This is a pattern that appears in Tartaria research consistently. The cities that were supposedly built new on empty or natural land in the 19th century carry street grids and building orientations that do not match the planning logic of the people who claim to have designed them. They match the logic of an older spatial order that the new construction was overlaid onto. Sometimes that order is partially visible in old maps. Sometimes it is visible only in the anomalies, the streets that bend around something that should not be there, the lots that are oddly shaped because the property line follows an older boundary. The intersections that occur at angles that make no sense for the grid but perfect sense if something already existed at that corner when the grid was laid. Boston has all of these anomalies, and Boston has something more specific. Boston has the physical evidence of raising. The raising of Boston is another piece of the official history that is taught as a straightforward engineering story. Beacon Hill, which was one of the original 3 hills of the Shawmut Peninsula, was in the early 19th century substantially higher than it is today. The official account says the hill was lowered by cutting it down and using the material to fill Mill Pond to the north, creating what is now the Bullfinch Triangle neighbourhood. This operation reportedly removed 60 feet from the top of Beacon Hill. The fill from that cut was deposited in the pond, and new streets were built on top. Stand at the current peak of Beacon Hill and look at the buildings around you. The buildings that were there before the cut. The ones that predate the operation. Their entrances are at the current street level. Their windows are positioned relative to the current ground surface in a way that makes them look normal, proportionally balanced, designed for the space they occupy. But they were not designed for the current ground level. They were designed for a ground level that was higher, which means the current street level is lower than what existed when those buildings were occupied by their original residents, which means the street was lowered, not the hill. The hill was cut, yes, but the cut material did not go entirely to Mill Pond. Some of it went down, into the streets, into the spaces between buildings, into the gaps that opened up when the surrounding grade was reduced to match a new intended level. Why would you lower the street level of a functioning neighbourhood? Why would you deliberately cut down the ground surface around buildings that were already in use, creating a new grade that puts the original ground floor partially below street level in some locations? The official answer involves drainage improvements and road standardization and the requirements of a growing city. None of those answers explain why you would choose to go down rather than maintain and build up. Unless maintaining the existing level was not the goal. Unless the goal was to bury the existing level. Unless what was at the existing level needed to be below the surface of the new story being constructed about this city. The buildings with their entrances partially below current street level are not unique to Beacon Hill. They appear throughout the oldest parts of Boston. They appear in streets that are documented as having existed continuously since the colonial period. Buildings where the first floor windows look out at the knees of pedestrians rather than at their faces. Buildings where you step down rather than up to enter the front door. Buildings where the original entrance has been sealed and a new one cut at current grade level, because the old entrance no longer functions as an entrance, it functions as a basement window. This is the pattern that Tartaria researchers have identified across dozens of cities on multiple continents. The buried first floor, the sealed entrance, the window that used to face the sky and now faces the dirt. In Europe it is visible in the old quarters of cities from Prague to Edinburgh to Paris. In North America, it appears in the oldest sections of cities that were supposedly built from nothing by European settlers in the 17th and 18th centuries. In every case, the official explanation involves soil accumulation or street grade changes for drainage, or the ordinary sediment of urban life accumulating over generations. The explanation sounds reasonable until you calculate what it requires. To bury a first floor to the degree visible in Boston's old streets requires the addition of multiple feet of material across an entire neighborhood. Soil does not accumulate at that rate through ordinary urban activity. The accumulation visible in these locations is not the product of centuries of dust and debris. It is the product of deliberate filling. Someone put that material there. Someone made a decision to raise the grade of entire districts by several feet and bury whatever was at the original surface. In Boston, the timeline of that decision aligns with the reset window, the period between roughly 1800 and 1870, when the most aggressive grade changes, the most extensive landfill operations, and the most dramatic alterations to the urban landscape were carried out. The same window that Tartaria research identifies as the period of the grand reset across the wider world. The same window in which the institutional apparatus for managing the new historical narrative was constructed. The Smithsonian, founded in 1846. The first comprehensive archaeological and geological surveys conducted under new institutional frameworks. The orphan trains moving children with no documented origins into new population centres. All of it concentrated in the same compressed period. Boston's expansion fits this framework precisely. The official story says the city was growing because the industrial economy was producing population pressure and commercial demand for land. That is true on its surface. But the specific choices made during the expansion, what to fill, what to raise, what to lower, what to bury, what to build on top of, those choices are not explained by population pressure. They are explained by the need to cover something that was already there, something that the new institutional narrative could not accommodate because its existence contradicted the timeline being installed. The harbour fills themselves deserve more scrutiny than they receive. When you fill a harbour, you are making a permanent decision about what will never again be visible. The material that goes in on top covers everything that was on the bottom, and Boston Harbour was not an empty body of water before the fills began. There are records, scattered and incomplete but present, of structures discovered during dredging operations in the harbour in the 19th century. Stonework, timber construction. Objects recovered from areas that the official chronology says were open water at any human timescale. The standard response to these records is that the structures were colonial-era dumping, or remnants of wharves and docks that had collapsed into the harbour and subsided, or artefacts from shipwrecks. What the standard response does not engage with is the depth at which some of these materials were found, or the character of the construction, or in the spatial distribution of the finds across areas of the harbour bottom that the official account says were never above water within any human time frame. Something was under Boston Harbour before Boston existed. The fill operations of the 19th century put 20 to 30 additional feet of material on top of it. Whatever was there is now under the landfill, under the buildings, mine under the streets, under the infrastructure. It is not accessible, it is not being studied, it is being stood on. Consider what the harbour bottom represents as an archive. When material sinks into harbour sediment and is left undisturbed, it preserves remarkably well. The anaerobic conditions of deep mud prevent the biological decay that destroys organic material on land. Timber structures buried in harbour sediment can survive for centuries, in a condition that still reveals their construction details. Stonework in harbour sediment stays in place. The spatial relationships between foundation elements are maintained by the pressure of the sediment above. An intact building foundation on the harbour bottom is one of the most durable forms of physical evidence that exists. And Boston Harbour has been systematically covered with filter depths that make any future investigation without extraordinary engineering effort essentially impossible. The fill is not just concealment, it is permanent concealment, deliberate, engineered and documented as an act of civic improvement. The timing of the most aggressive fill operations deserves attention in this context. The Back Bay fill accelerated dramatically in the 1850s and 1860s. The South Bay and South Cove fills proceeded through the same decades. The Harbour Edge fills, the creation of the wharfing districts on top of what had been open water, ran from the 1820s forward. All of it concentrated in the decades immediately following the reset window. All of it producing irreversible physical burial of what was below the waterline. All of it framed in the documentation as progress, as commerce, as the natural consequence of a growing city embracing its industrial destiny. The framing is perfect, the timing is suspicious. The question of what was under the harbour connects directly to the question of what the Shawmut Peninsula actually was before the English arrived in the 1630s. The official account says it was a sparsely inhabited area used by the Massachusetts people as a fishing and seasonal camp location. The peninsula was chosen for settlement because of its defensible geography and its access to deep water. That is the story. The geography of the original Shawmut Peninsula is more interesting than the story allows. 3 hills arranged in a specific configuration, harbour access on 3 sides, freshwater springs. The hills of the Shawmut are described in the earliest colonial documents as being remarkable for their symmetry and their prominence. Remarkable enough that early settlers named the entire peninsula after the 3 hills, Tremountain, 3 mountains, and then immediately set about cutting 2 of them down. You do not cut down remarkable landscape features because you need the gravel. Gravel was not scarce in early colonial New England. You do not invest the labour required to reduce 2 of your 3 landmark hills if the goal is simply to fill a pond. The filling of Mill Pond could have been accomplished with material from any number of other sources. The decision to specifically reduce the hills of Shawmut, to lower the most prominent features of the landscape, to bring them down from their original heights, was not a practical engineering decision. It was an act of erasure. The hills were landmarks of the previous order. The new order required them gone. The buildings that were on those hills at their original heights no longer exist at their original heights. They exist, some of them, at their current grade, because they were buried to a depth corresponding to the amount the surrounding landscape was cut. The building did not move. The ground moved around it. When you lower the grade of a hill by cutting it and redistributing the material, the buildings that were on that hill descend relative to the new grade. Their basements become sub-basements. Their first floors become basements. Their entrances get sealed and new ones cut at the new level. This is exactly what you see in the oldest structures of Beacon Hill. The oldest structures of Beacon Hill are not colonial. Some of what is treated and preserved as colonial architecture in that neighbourhood does not match what colonial-era construction in New England actually looked like. The quality of the stonework, the proportions of the windows, the weight and thickness of the walls, these features match construction techniques and material standards that the official colonial timeline cannot account for. They match the construction that appears across dozens of cities in multiple countries, all attributed to periods and civilizations that supposedly had none of the capability required to produce it. Look specifically at the granite construction visible in the oldest foundations of the Beacon Hill neighbourhood. Granite is not a soft stone. Cutting it to precise dimensions requires either iron tools of considerable hardness and refinement, or mechanical assistance of a kind that the colonial period in New England did not possess in the quantities the surviving construction requires. The earliest colonial settlers in Massachusetts are documented as having arrived with limited tool inventories. They were building with what they could produce locally or import in small quantities across the Atlantic. The scale and precision of the granite work in the oldest surviving foundations of the Shawmut Peninsula is not consistent with that toolkit. It is consistent with a construction tradition that had access to tools and techniques that arrived here before the colonial period or developed here through a history that the official timeline has removed. The specific cutting patterns in the oldest granite are worth examining. The facework, the joint tolerances, the corner treatments. These are not the work of craftsmen improvising with available materials under frontier conditions. These are the signatures of a construction tradition with deep practice and refined methods, a tradition that had been building in granite long enough to develop the shortcuts and the efficiencies that only appear after generations of accumulated experience with a material. You do not produce that quality of work the first time you try granite. You produce it after a long time of working granite. And the official history of New England has no long time of working granite before the colonial period, because the official history of New England begins with the colonial period and declares everything before it to be either indigenous or natural. The Tartaria hypothesis does not require you to believe in a single unified empire spanning the planet. It requires only that you accept what the physical evidence in front of you actually shows. Buildings constructed to standards beyond what the official timeline allows. Street grids oriented according to spatial logics older than the cities that contain them. Landscape features deliberately removed or buried at a specific moment in history. An institutional apparatus constructed immediately after that moment to provide the explanatory framework that prevents anyone from asking what was removed and why. And Boston is one of the clearest examples of all of this on the American continent, because Boston's expansion was so thoroughly documented by the people doing it. The engineering records of the Back Bay fill, the survey documents from the Beacon Hill Cut, the harbour dredging reports, all of it is preserved and archived and in some cases digitized. The documentation exists. What the documentation does not do is tell you what was found. It tells you what was done. It does not tell you what the doing was for. Reading those records as an act of concealment rather than as a record of construction changes what they reveal. The meticulousness of the documentation becomes suspicious rather than reassuring. The comprehensiveness of the record keeping becomes a strategy rather than a service. Every measurement, every contract, in every delivery of fill material creates a paper trail that fills the archive space where the questions about what was underneath should be. You cannot ask what was buried when you are holding 1,000 pages of documentation about the logistics of burying it. The neighborhoods built on the landfill are now among the most expensive real estate in America. The Back Bay, the South End, the waterfront districts that sit on filled harbor land. The value of that land is treated as self-evident. Premium location, historic neighborhood, desirable urban environment. The premium is real, but the history is curated. The land is valuable partly because it is beautiful and central and well designed. It is also valuable because the investment in it was enormous, and the investment in it was enormous because of what the investment covered. You do not fill an entire harbour unless you have a reason. The official reason is land scarcity and commercial demand. But land scarcity in 19th century Boston, in a region with vast interior territories, in a country with a continental frontier still being settled, is not a convincing driver for the scale of investment that the Boston landfill represented. You do not move mountains, literally, and fill harbours because you need more room for warehouses. You move mountains and fill harbours because you need the mountains moved and the harbour filled. The warehouses are the justification. The erasure is the purpose. This is the structure of the reset wherever it appears. The cover story is always plausible. It is always economic or practical or driven by natural disaster or required by population growth, or demanded by warfare or disease. The cover story always has enough truth in it to pass inspection. The Irish famine cleared Western Ireland of its population. That is true. The plague cleared large portions of medieval Europe. That is true. The Great Fire of Chicago allowed the rebuilding of an entire city centre. That is true. The cover story contains true events. What it does not contain is the underlying logic that selected those events, amplified them, and used their consequences to accomplish what needed to be accomplished. Boston did not burn. Boston did not flood. Boston did not suffer a catastrophe that required its reconstruction. Boston was simply, deliberately, extensively rearranged. Its hills were cut, its harbour was filled. Its streets were reoriented and its grades were changed, and its oldest structures were either buried to their first floors or quietly demolished and replaced with new construction that fit the story being told about what this place was. A colonial settlement, a city of the New World, a place with no meaningful history before the English arrived in the 1630s. But the stones underneath the fill disagree, the foundations below the current grade disagree, The orientation of the street grid disagrees, the proportions of the older surviving buildings disagree, the documents of the fill operations read against the grain of their intent disagree. Boston was already a city when the English arrived, not a city in the sense of a settlement or a camp or a village. A city in the sense of infrastructure and planning and construction that required capabilities and a timeline that neither the Massachusetts people nor the colonial settlers can account for. A city that the colonial project inherited and then concealed by raising the ground around it, filling the water over it, cutting down the hills that marked it, and writing a history that started the clock in 1630 and declared everything before that date to be wilderness. The wilderness was not empty, the harbour was not natural, the hills were not random, and the city beneath Boston is not a ruin. It is a foundation, the foundation of a place that existed before the story that replaced it. The foundation is still there, under the landfill, under the streets, under the buildings that the official history says were the first ones ever built here. They were not the first. They were built on top of the first, and between the two layers there is several feet of fill material, carefully deposited, thoroughly documented in its logistics, and entirely silent about its purpose. The harbour water that was filled in did not cover nothing. The hills that were cut did not sit on nothing. The streets that were not lowered through empty ground. What they covered is still there. Boston sits on it. Boston was built over it. And the city you walk through today is not the first one to occupy this ground. It is just the one that filled in the harbour, so you would never have to know there was another. And it did its job well. But the fill has edges, the fill has depths, the fill has a bottom, and what is at the bottom was there before anyone alive today was told this story began. If this raised more questions for you than it answered, that is the correct response. Because the next question is the one that matters. If Boston was built over something, and Chicago was rebuilt after a fire that was suspiciously comprehensive, and San Francisco was rebuilt after an earthquake that was suspiciously convenient, and city after city across North America shows the same pattern of a buried older layer under a newer one installed in the same compressed historical window, then what was the thing that all of those cities replaced? What was on this continent before the story we were given said it was wilderness? That is the question this channel exists to pursue. It does not have a comfortable answer. Subscribe and we follow it together.